Hey students, this is Professor Gore, and this is part three of the Cold War America recorded lecture. And so in this particular lecture, I want to kind of talk about Eisenhower's presidency particularly, and then in the next topic, we'll get into the kind of the 1950s culture stuff, which is usually kind of fun topic for kids, or for students, I should say. And so Eisenhower was one American that was extremely popular because of his war hero status throughout American history. Winfield Scott is about the only war hero, big time war hero in American history that has ever lost as running for president. He lost in the 1850s. Eisenhower, being the four-star general and the American commander in the European conflict during World War II, and also at one point head of NATO. He was both Democrats and Republicans wanted him to run for their party, knowing that Eisenhower most likely would win. He ends up deciding to be a Republican, and it was kind of interesting. His campaign slogan, a lot of buttons were sold. It says, "We like Ike." And so what's interesting about Eisenhower is a lot of his likability as kind of a war hero. He was very smart. He was able to kind of bring a lot of people together. He does that in World War II and tries to implement that in his presidency as well. His vice president is actually going to be Richard Nixon. So in Eisenhower's 8 years in office, there's going to be quite a few issues that happen because the civil rights movement truly begins during his presidency. You could argue that it begins with Truman enacting the executive order that integrated the military. But there's several Supreme Court cases that happened during his presidency. There's a series of 5 cases, which Brown versus Board of Education is the one that we often remember in history, that overturns the infamous Supreme Court decision in the 1890s of Plessy versus Ferguson, which had made it where you could have separate but equal facilities based on race. Public schools are also going to be ordered to integrate as a result of that Brown versus Board of Education case. Also, during his presidency, you're going to see Rosa Parks getting arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus where she was supposed to sit in the back instead of the front. And that's going to lead to the Montgomery bus boycott, and that's a big movement in the civil rights thing. You also see Dr. King as kind of this unofficial leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. You also are going to see Eisenhower taking action in the civil rights movement with students trying to attend Little Rock Central High School. He's actually going to send in federal troops to make sure that they go to the school the rest of the year. But during the Cold War, there's also going to be some issues as well that we're going to cover in this lecture. So his campaign slogan is K1C2. He's going to end the war in Korea, which he does within just a couple months of being in office. He's going to continue to contain communism. Okay, every president from Truman on until the end of the Cold War is going to try to contain communism and also try to end corruption in the government. Of course, getting Joseph McCarthy out of the Senate was one way to do that. So election 1952, he's going to run against Adlai Stevenson, who's the governor of Illinois. Adlai Stevenson was a pretty prominent politician at this time. In fact, he's the one that's going to go to the United Nations with the Cuban Missile Crisis and show the evidence that the Soviet Union was putting missile silos in Cuba, and kind of calls out the Soviet Union from the UN and kind of leaves them speechless. And he runs against him twice. But the problem is it's Eisenhower, and Eisenhower as a war hero is tough to beat in an election. So one of the things that you'll see as well with Eisenhower's presidency is what some historians call modern republicanism. And so he wants to limit the power of the presidency, where the president is not having as much power as, say, FDR had or previous presidents such as Woodrow Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt or something. He also wanted to kind of slow the size of the government. The government agencies had expanded under Truman because of the Cold War, and also wanted to increase the authority of Congress and the courts. And so that does happen with those 5 important Supreme Court cases that overturn separate but equal. You're also going to see some more Supreme Court cases like Boynton versus Virginia that's going to end segregation on public transportation facilities. You're going to see quite a few influential Supreme Court cases in the 1960s that we'll cover in a later lecture that are going to impact things such as your Miranda rights and among other things. And so that's kind of where you start seeing that emerge. So Richard Nixon is going to be his vice presidential candidate. Nixon kind of had some controversy when during the campaign because Nixon was accused of receiving some improper campaign donations and so forth, and that were illegal. Now Nixon goes on national television and kind of gives a speech that appealed to Americans. It was actually pretty smart politically. He said, I've never received any personal financial donations that weren't used for a campaign, yada, yada. The only thing we have received is we received our dog Checkers. And he says, and that the kids love that dog. And I want to say, regardless, that we're going to keep it. So basically, he's like kind of appealed to Americans who own dogs and so forth. It was pretty smart because he kind of dodged that bullet, and Eisenhower did not remove him from the ticket. And he becomes the vice president for the next 8 years, and then eventually tries to run for president a couple times. He loses in 1960 to JFK, and then he wins in 68 against Hubert Humphrey, and then wins again in 72 against George McGovern. So Eisenhower was kind of stereotyped that he was always out playing golf and was kind of not really managing things as hands-on and so forth. But historians have really realized that actually that's not the case. That may have been the appearance, but historians call it the hidden hand presidency. He was really good at delegating tasks and doing things behind closed doors because that's what he had done in World War II. And so that's that kind of stereotype during the time was not accurate the way historians have looked at it in recent decades. So one of the things he does, well, it makes sense. He increases veterans benefits. Well, as a veteran himself, that would make sense. And so it's one thing that the government typically tries to do is take care of its veterans. He does increase Social Security. This is something that Truman had tried to pass with the Fair Deal, but was unable to do. And so it's the first Social Security monthly raise that people that are on Social Security receive since it was enacted in 1935. And then also he increased the minimum wage. I mentioned this in one of the earlier parts that Truman was unable to get this passed. Eisenhower does increase the minimum wage to $1 an hour. I remember when I started working, I think I was making $6 an hour and minimum wage was $5.15, and I thought I was doing great as a high schooler making more than minimum wage. He does create some new governmental departments, which is kind of interesting because it kind of goes against some of the modern republicanism I was just talking about, because you typically want to shrink the size of the government. But as time goes along, there's going to be new government agencies created because of the growing country and also the growing issues that the country is going to handle. So he does create the new Department of Health, also creates a new Department of Education. So it's the first time that you see the federal government kind of getting involved in education. And really, LBJ is the one who's going to get the federal government much more involved in education than had been previously. And then he also expanded welfare, which was another thing that was kind of contradicted some of the modern republicanism and so forth that he had advocated in his campaign. And so welfare increased in the 1950s, and it's really going to increase significantly in the 1960s. As we'll see when we get to the 1960s stuff, it's going to be difficult to pay for the Vietnam War and the Great Society. You can pay for one, but you can't pay for both and still cut taxes at the same time. And even paying for one would have been tough. And so his three biggest achievements are, and I think this is one of the best things, this is just my personal opinion, so don't take this as historical fact by any means, but I think it was one of the best, some of the best money the government's ever spent in the 20th century, the National Interstate Defense Highway Act, and that's created our interstate system. Because if you think about our interstate highway system today, it affects every single American, okay? Because of it allows transportation costs to go down because of trucks can ship stuff faster, a trucking company, I should say, and that enables to reduce the price of goods. Americans travel on many of these highways every day, or at least yearly. It allows Americans to travel for tourism and vacation, to use them for public transportation if you're taking a bus. It also makes Americans' lives easier, particularly if you live in a city or urban area, because if you've ever been to a country like I've been to Guatemala City a couple times, the traffic is horrendous because they have basically shitty streets everywhere. They don't have any interstate systems that can allow you to get from point A to point B much quicker without having red lights and so forth. You think about all the jobs that the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act has created. Think about all the restaurants and hotels and stores and so forth that have developed along the interstate highway system. And also, he got the idea from the Germans with the German Autobahn. And if you've ever been on an interstate highway system, now if you're in the mountains, that's an exception. But typically, if you're on an interstate, about every 5 miles, there's at least a straightaway. And the reason why, so that way, if a plane ever needed to make an emergency landing, it could land on the highway. And it also was done in case we ever went to the war with the Soviet Union, we could move troops north to south, east to west quickly and much easier. And it's really one of the greatest infrastructure projects in American history, and certainly the largest. So if you ever go to some other countries, you'll notice that our roads and highways are usually much better unless you're going to a certain country. He also passed NASA. We're going to talk about why NASA was created here in just a minute, but that was a very important thing. And then also the National Defense and Education Act. And so I'm going to cover this as well when we get to the space race, because this is going to allocate money to be spent. If you were a math or science whiz, you could actually go to college for free as long as you went into a career in math and science. And so that way, ever since then, our country in education has had a big emphasis on math and science, and it goes back to the space race days. So if you look at the federal highways of 1950, this is before the interstate highway system. We had a lot of highways. In fact, I've traveled on some of these, and they always went through towns. And so as you know, as you go through towns, you have red lights, stop signs, and so forth, and it slows things up. Plus, you can kind of bottleneck in towns. Now, a lot of towns relied on this traffic for income, and so that is going to hurt them when they try to when these highways are actually going to bypass some of those towns. I always like to bring this reference because some of you, when you were younger, may have seen the movie Cars. My children love it. And in that movie, Radiator Springs was bypassed by the interstate. And you actually saw towns that kind of fizzled out as a result of the highways bypassing, because they went out in the rural areas so they could go much faster and so forth. So that is a negative downside of the interstate highway system. Now, also the 1950s was, you kind of had this American culture centered around the car. You began having the first fast food restaurants. The first McDonald's opened up in 1955. And so that ends up spreading once Ray Kroc begins working with the founders of McDonald's to franchise it across the nation. Howard Johnson's hotels, they're not as big as, not near as big as they used to be, but we see a lot of hotel chains around the country today. And then drive-in movies. My parents love going to drive-in movies. They actually began in the 1930s during the Great Depression, because you could go see 2 films for the price of one. It was a way to get people who were struggling in the Great Depression to go pay to see movies. And so, because drive-in movies were a little bit easier, quicker, or easier to operate, because you have to have heating and cooling costs inside theater. Anyway, it was very popular in the 50s and 60s and later to go see drive-in movies. If you live in the DFW area, there is a drive-in movie theater in Ennis. And I think there may be one out towards Louisville and so forth. But pretty cool thing to go see. You look at the amount of cars before World War II. The average American family had about 1 car. Not everybody had a car, but that was probably more so the average than not. But then after World War II, starting in the 1950s, Americans started owning 2 cars. So dad would drive to work in one, and then mom would have the other car to be able to drive around kids to different activities. Okay, and the cost of the Federal Interstate Highway Act was $32 billion. And but it was money well spent. You think about how much it's benefited the economy since that. And you see, this is the classic cars, the old classic Chevy Corvettes, the Cadillacs, the big fenders and so forth. These suckers were made out of steel, and these things were like tanks. If I had a modern large SUV today versus like a 1955 Chevy or Ford, in a car accident, I would take my money on the 1950s things. The whole thing was made out of steel. Also, in the mid-1950s, you have Disneyland is created. Now, Disneyland and Disney World, of course, a lot of people fly there, but a lot of people in California drive to Disneyland. A lot of people in Florida and I know other people that have driven down to Orlando to go to Disney World. None of that would be possible without Americans owning mass amounts of cars, and also the interstate highway system that allows people to get there much quicker. Because if you're going on old school highways, you're going to have to take off more days from work to travel somewhere. And 40% of guests came from outside of California. That's because they had the car in the interstate highway system. You also had other amusement parks such as Frontierland, Tomorrowland, and others. And of course, later Six Flags and Busch Gardens and so forth are going to develop. Also, that you began seeing post World War II is the growth of the Sun Belt states. Okay. Now, I always like to tell kids or students, I'm sorry, that it's kind of like a smiley face across the country with some missing teeth in this region, and so forth, because more and more Americans are moving to the Sun Belt states. These are states that traditionally remain sunny most of the year. Okay. And their population increases because, well, the main reason why a lot of defense contractors have facilities or businesses in these states. So you see a big jump in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, Arizona shoots up, Nevada because of government contracts tremendously, and then California as well. And so these are traditionally very sunny states. They increased in terms of population, but you see, New York doesn't increase the way it had in previous decades with all the immigration coming there to New York. Also, the workforce began to change. You began seeing, instead of the majority of Americans in blue-collar jobs, you started seeing in the decades after World War II, the majority of Americans are in white-collar jobs. And that was the first time in American history that white-collar jobs ever outnumbered blue-collar jobs and overall workers. And the reason for this is defense spending, defense spending, defense spending. If it wasn't for the massive amount of money being spent during the Cold War on defense expenditures, that probably would not have happened. The other reason why there's more white-collar jobs than ever before is because of the GI Bill. The GI Bill provides free college or trade school money for veterans, and there's a ton of veterans after World War II, and about 13 million end up taking advantage of it from World War II and Korea conflicts. So you have more college-educated people. You also have more trade school-educated people. So if you're a skilled laborer, whether you be a welder or a plumber or some other type of skilled job, you're going to make more income and therefore have more people in the middle class. And this also, because of the Cold War, you're going to have science and technology is going to increase rapidly. And a lot of products that come about for the consumer sector were developed because of the space race, trying to develop technology for NASA and so forth, like microwaves is one of those things that actually came to consumer spending because of NASA. But speaking of NASA, what leads to the space race is Sputnik. The Soviets in 1957 have won up the United States with the launching of the first satellites of world history into outer space. It didn't stay up in outer space that long, but that's not the point. The fact that they can shoot a rocket with a satellite up into outer space shows that they could potentially shoot a nuclear warhead all the way to the United States. And Americans panic. And you see the increased amount of duck and cover drills and so forth. And so the United States is going to get with it and math and science and try to one up the Soviets. And so NASA is going to be launched soon after. And it's not very long. The United States is able to send its first satellite into outer space. And so what's going to happen is this National Defense Education Act gets passed. Notice it's got defense in the front. It's saying that education is key to defense. And so this is the first time that the federal government ever gets involved in education. And this is why Eisenhower created the Department of Education. It's because of the space race. And NASA gets credited as a result of it. Now, even though Eisenhower creates NASA, Kennedy is the one who really pushed for NASA when he was president. And really, the reason why the United States is on the moon is because of Kennedy pushing so much for NASA, the money going towards it, and the NASA trying to do that, even though Nixon was president when it actually happened. So anyway, basically, scholarships were given to college for math and science whizzes as long as you agreed to go into a career in math and science. Typically, they were for defense contractors and so forth. So we can't let the Soviets have technological or educational advantages. My dad remembers doing duck and cover drills because he lived in Whitehall, Arkansas, right outside of the Pine Bluff Arsenal, which is a military base. In fact, the Soviets had a nuclear warhead pointed at Redfield, Arkansas, that was going to supposedly take out that and take out the Little Rock Air Force Base in Jacksonville, Arkansas, with one big massive missile. And so that's because of Sputnik. They increased the number of duck and cover drills. People began building bomb shelters underneath their houses, like fallout shelters. And also, you had increased number of atomic testing that happened. And so you look at the space race here. There's a list of different satellites went outer space. Some are the Soviets, some are the Americans, and so forth. That was happening. It's a constant one-up competition. Another thing that happened domestically when Eisenhower was president, and I can't make this up, this is actually in American history textbooks. There was a bill passed that was going to round up illegal immigrants, and they called it Operation Wetback. Now, today that would be a lawsuit waiting to happen because it's a very racial slur and so forth, but it is the 1950s, and they got away with it. Anyway, the Operation Wetback was trying to round up illegal immigrants. That's basically what you need to know, particularly coming from Latin America. Also, the FDR with the Indian New Deal had gotten rid of the Dawes Act. Well, they brought it back. And then eventually Kennedy's going to get rid of it in 1961. So it's kind of a inconsistent government policy towards Native Americans, not exactly something that we're proud of today. Now, so Eisenhower does end the Cold War within 6 months. Campaign promise accomplished. His Secretary of State at the time was John Foster Dulles, and then his brother was head of the CIA. The Dulles brothers had a lot of influence, but Dulles advocated a little more aggressive foreign policy than Truman's containment. He advocated brinkmanship. Now, thankfully, Eisenhower didn't really do all of that. But what brinkmanship was is you threaten nuclear war all the way up to the brink, and then you back off. So it's kind of like playing chicken and so forth, except you're playing with nuclear weapons. That's never good. You don't want to play with that too much, but it was supposed to be a little more aggressive towards the Soviet Union. But what's interesting, though, is that when Stalin dies, 1953, 1954, the guy who replaces him, Nikita Khrushchev, was a lot more reasonable than Stalin. He thought that the U.S. and the Soviet Union could peacefully coexist. He also was a famous Soviet Union general on the Eastern Front during World War II and helped win at the Battle of Stalingrad. And he and Eisenhower, being World War II veterans, respected each other. And it started working out pretty well until the U-2 spy plane incident. So here is Khrushchev, who was actually Time Magazine Man of the Year at one point, far better than Stalin. And he's always remembered because of the gap between seats. He's actually the first Soviet leader to ever travel to the United States, and he does so. This slide is to reference the Radio Moscow versus the Voice of America, and basically blasting about how the other economic system is evil to each other. There's Radio Moscow's advertisement. Now, Mad Magazine, which later creates Mad TV, started kind of making fun of the spying that was going on between the CIA and the KGB. And so you always see the spy versus spy cartoons. And the point is that they always were spying on each other like this one, and then nobody ever really won. They ended up destroying each other at the end, and that was the point. They were making fun of this Cold War tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the CIA, and the KGB. Now, one thing that happens in 1956 is Hungary. The people were sick of this oppressive communist government, and because of popular pressure, the Hungarian prime minister promised free elections. Well, the Communist Party did not want that because they didn't want to lose power. And so what ends up happening is the Soviet Union, particularly parts of the Warsaw Pact, send in a bunch of tanks and troops to put down this popular uprising, and they literally crush people with tanks in the street, like literally, not figuratively. They actually crush some people who are protesters. Eisenhower's got a tough position he's put in here. Do you support the Hungarians with their push for democracy and most likely have World War III, or do you let events play out and hope that the Hungarians are successful? He chooses the second option, and unfortunately for the Hungarians, they are oppressed by the members of the Warsaw Pact military forces. And what the Warsaw Pact is basically an alliance militarily between Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union. This is a kind of a dark silhouette at night after a nuclear testing and so forth. Eventually, Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev are going to work on an agreement to stop nuclear testing, particularly above ground and below ground and so forth, because they're worried about it's going to poison the water supply. And Nevada was one of the big areas that we did a lot of nuclear testing. And so Eisenhower and Khrushchev worked on that, and then Kennedy and LBJ did actually pass a limited test ban treaty in 1963. It banned testing underground. And if you ever get a chance with Google Earth, you can search Vegas, and then if you go northwest of there, where this site is, you can see a bunch of craters from where they tested stuff. Now, one of the things that Eisenhower did is he wanted to build a nuclear arsenal, not because he wanted to use nuclear weapons, but just to discourage the Soviet Union from ever jacking with us. And so he does build more hydrogen bombs. They do test some atmospheric testing, which is not good for the environment, and also develop long-range bombing capabilities. And one of the things that he did is establish the distant early warning system across our country. So we'll see it play out usually for our weather early warning systems today. So let's say it's the first Wednesday of the month and it's a clear day at noon, you'll hear the weather emergency testing that you'll hear those sirens going off, and that's because of that. Also, both countries developed what's called intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are missiles that are fired up out of a missile silo out of the ground. They go up into space and they come back down on wherever it's coming on, and then I call them civilization killers because they're massive missiles in terms of their nuclear capabilities. But because of that, it eventually kind of scares both countries. And in 1959, Eisenhower and Khrushchev are working towards limiting nuclear weapons and having an arms limitation deal. And it would have been great for world history had it actually gone into effect. And it doesn't actually go into effect until Nixon is president in the 1970s. But what ends up happening is the U-2 spy plane incident actually ruins those talks. Now, Khrushchev was probably looking for a reason anyway to build the Berlin Wall, because they were tired of Berliners and East Germans escaping East Germany via West Berlin. But what ends up happening is an American spy plane flown by Colonel Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet airspace. Now, here's the deal. The Soviet Union was spying on us without question, or spying on the United States, and the United States was spying on the Soviet Union. The problem is the United States got its hand caught in the cookie jar doing it. And so Bridge of Spies is a movie with Tom Hanks that's kind of portrays where Tom Hanks' character is trying to get Francis Powers back because he was, held in prison over in the Soviet Union as a result of this. And anyway, they eventually released him years later, and that's what the movie Bridge of Spies is about. So, but it's a kind of I haven't seen the movie, but I've heard it's pretty good. So U-2 spy plane incident is a really kind of a PR nightmare, and Eisenhower has to go on national television and apologize, and it looks bad. It was definitely a stain on his presidency. All right, one of the things that develops during this time, that should be a capital O there, is the creation of NATO. It's actually proposed by the Prime Minister of Canada, and so it consists of the U.S. and Canada and several Western European countries, and it's basically a foreign alliance to protect each other. It's collective security. So it's like an attack on one is an attack on all. So if you were wanting to go out to a concert and it was in a sketchy part of town and so forth, it'd be better if you went in a group, hence collective security. And so when NATO was formed, the Soviet Union, not to be one-upped, is going to have their counterpart with the Warsaw Pact. And at that point, the United States officially, and ever since then, has abandoned its policy of isolation and actually abandoned George Washington's recommendation of staying out of foreign alliances. And so West Germany ends up becoming into part of NATO as well. And people that wanted to remain isolated are going to lose out on this politically. And so the Warsaw Pact is created as a result of the creation of NATO, and Warsaw is the capital of Poland. That's where they met to start this. And so you also see other treaty alliances that take place around the world. So Southeast Asia Treaty Organization called CETO they're actually going to fight in the Vietnam conflict. Now, the United States is going to provide more troops than anybody else besides South Vietnam, and or what we call the ARVN troops. And so you see the same thing with Middle East with CENTO, and then the Rio Pact in Latin America. And all these are countries that are allied with the United States, pushing for democracy and capitalism. You see that the Soviet Union is trying to create similar agreements with communist countries as well. So it's a constant one-up competition in the Cold War and so forth. Now, one of the things that Eisenhower did is he did this Eisenhower Doctrine, which he said he would pledge any support that money-wise of any country that's resisting communism. And so one thing that happened at this time is the CIA is going to stage a couple different country takeovers via coup to put in pro-American leaders. One of them is the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was a pro-American until he is overthrown by the Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution in 1979. But Soviet Union was trying to acquire Iran by kind of invading it, taking it over, and they were going to get its vast oil reserves. So putting in a pro-American leader there, it's kind of stopped the Soviet Union from doing that. In Guatemala, the reason why the CIA engineered a coup against Guzman was a popularly elected communist. And one of the things that when Guatemala, it's not exactly, definitely had some selfish economic reasons, but the United Fruit Company had a bunch of land where they had for their fruit crops. It gets seized and nationalized by Guzman, and they were not happy about that. But the CIA engineered a coup to get rid of him, to put a pro-American guy in there. The problem is that guy was a ruthless dictator, and so we're going to see that Jimmy Carter is going to reverse some of that. In the Cold War, you got to understand it's a trial and error. We've never really been involved in foreign affairs permanent like this. The Cold War is going to be full of some mistakes, also some successes. Supporting some bad leaders just because they were not communists is going to go down as one of the failures of the Cold War for the United States. Some good things are, intervening on behalf of South Korea in the Korean War, and the Berlin airlift, and among several other things of the Cold War. So it is kind of a trial and error, us, the United States, being in new territory with foreign policy. Now, Vietnam, it actually starts with Vietnam was wanting to gain independence from France. When the Japanese ruthlessly invade French Indochina, which was a colony for France from imperialism days, they helped fight against the Japanese. And so they assumed that, hey, we helped fight against the Japanese by waging guerrilla warfare, that France will reward us with independence. Well, France's pride is hurt after the war, and they're trying to reclaim some of their empire, and they don't want that to happen. And so, led by Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese fight a revolution against the French, and they defeat them at Dien Bien Phu, this fortress in northern Vietnam. Now, the problem is the Vietnamese people have trouble deciding, are they going to be democratic or communist? And so the Geneva Convention decides to separate it along the 18th or 19th parallel, and northern Vietnam would be communist and southern Vietnam would be democratic. And so what's sad is that people were forced to leave their homeland. So if you were communist living in the south, you're forced north. If you were democratic living in the north, you're forced south. And that's a problem. But the real concern, though, for the United States foreign policy is this domino theory, the theory that if one country falls to communism, the whole region will fall to communism. And that's actually what happens when Vietnam does fall to communism in the south. So Ho Chi Minh is going to be the elected leader of North Vietnam, and then Ngo Diem is going to be the elected leader in the south. They were supposed to have a unification election in 1956, but Diem knew he was going to lose. He was unpopular, he actually kind of was a little more oppressive to the Buddhist population, and Diem was Catholic. Anyway, but it causes issues and so forth. And Truman was asked by Ho Chi Minh to push for independence for Vietnam, and Truman actually favored that, but he felt like he had to support France because he needed France against the Soviet Union. Eisenhower comes in and kind of continues that, but he starts sending a little bit of money and troops to protect Diem's regime to prevent the domino theory from taking place in Southeast Asia. In the Middle East, Israel is established. In Palestine after World War II, the UN, particularly the British, in the Balfour Declaration, helped establish that. That's going to be tremendously controversial because local Palestinians are angered about that. They did not want a joint Palestinian and Jewish state. And what ends up happening as soon as Israel declares itself its own country, the Palestinians, the Jordanians, the Syrians, and Egyptians declare war on Israel, and Israel actually wins. And what's interesting is that because they declare war, the Palestinians actually had more territory before that, and then they lost more territory as a result. And then Israel as a nation is officially recognized in 1949. In Egypt, to combat against the imperialism days in world affairs, Nasser became power as a general in the Egyptian army in 1954, and he was brilliant in the Cold War at playing the Soviet Union and the U.S. off against each other. So what he does is he was looking to create a tremendous infrastructure project for the Egyptian economy, and the Nile River is the longest river in the world. If you dam it up, then you've got a great hydroelectric dam. That's an extremely expensive infrastructural project. I mean, expensive. Well, the U.S. wanted to gain Egyptian favor, and that's a very important region of the world, and don't want them to become communists, and so that we offered aid. Well, Nasser took that offer from the U.S. and then balanced it off against the Soviet Union and said, hey, here's what the Americans will offer us. What will you offer us? And they end up offering even more. But what's crazy is they were able to play off the Soviet Union against each other, and eventually the U.S. counter offered and so forth to aid. And we actually aid Egypt as a result of that. But one of the things that Nasser did is he nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, France, and Israel joined forces, and they attacked Israel. Now, this is one Cold War area that the U.S. did make a good decision in. And so the U.S. was like, whoa, 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 this is going to erupt into a broader conflict with the Soviet Union. And so it told Britain, France, and Israel to back off after they had retaken the Suez Canal. And he said he cut off their oil, so they were forced to pull out. And so Britain, France, and Israel ends up backing out of Egypt because of U.S. intervention with cutting off their oil. And this leads to the Eisenhower Doctrine, where Eisenhower basically said, I'm going to support any nation with financial aid or military aid that is actively resisting communism in the Middle East or North African region. Now, when Eisenhower leaves office, he realizes what had developed over the last 8 years he'd been in office. This tremendous military spending led to what he called the military-industrial complex. He said that we're become too dependent on military spending, but also we're becoming obsessed, and it's shaping our whole society and culture with this Cold War. And he warned that this was not good for the nation long term. And it was a wise farewell address warning. And we'll get to the 1950s culture stuff in a different lecture.